Uh, Hi guys, welcome to my presentation, Apps in the Cloud. And yeah, thanks for coming. Today it's a really hot day today, so yeah, I appreciate all of you coming and sitting rather than eating ice cream or doing something else, or maybe just watching this and eating ice cream. First of all, I wanted to thank Andrea and yeah, .NET Cambridge meetup, and thank you for inviting me and letting me talk today. And thanks Dimitrios for a very interesting presentation. It's especially convenient for me because it kind of the topics overlap. Well, you can probably figure it out from the title even. Um, so yeah, it's great. It's gonna hopefully give a bit of a different angle, and hopefully it will somehow work well together. So yeah, let me dive into the today's topic. Um, yeah, I would like to start first with a little bit of the why and the what. What I'll just briefly describe what we're going to be doing today. Then I'll move on to actual demonstration. It's just going to be the what done, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for optional points of interest. Because yeah, it's a broad topic. I'll probably skip certain bits depending on the time. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. So yeah, let's begin. First of all, what am I gonna do? So the talk today is kind of a result of a project, like a side project that I did, which I decided to do because of certain common problems that I've seen in almost all projects that I've worked on professionally, and I'm pretty sure you guys will be able to relate to at least some of them. And I kind of categorize them in three categories, three sections: hosting, CI/CD pipeline, and app infrastructure. So I know it's probably a bit boring talking about this, but I'll just mention them very quickly and we'll move on to the interesting bit. So the hosting infrastructure problems, for me, a big one is the differences across environments, and I'm sure most people have had this problem. An example of that is you have a testing environment. You want to test a feature without it being on production, obviously, but your test environment is so different from production that actually, yeah, you can test, but still the feature actually gets properly tested only on production. Yeah, I was going for, well, so that's the thing that the infrastructure as code gives you, or at least helps you with, which is more repeatable deployments and more repeatable environments. Other points: lack of scalability, lack of auditability. Many a time somebody just goes directly to a server and changes something, and that's how we end up with these differences across environments. Managing access control, commissioning hardware, that's an obvious one. Maintaining and patching OS and software, and secure configuration. So the next category of problems related to, well, sometimes they kind of overlap a bit, but let's say this is more CI/CD related. The first one is CI/CD infrastructure, and in all projects I've worked on, the build servers and agents are all kind of either bare metal or at least managed to an extent. On DevOps, you can do that in the cloud. It has its limitations, like all the time, but for my demo project, it will work just fine. Sorry. Other things, separate tools for building and deploying. It's not a big one, but it's nice to have everything in one place. Lack of automated DB migrations. That's a big one for me. Lack of automated acceptance tests, and downtime during deployment. And then the final category of problems, I think the biggest one for me is logging related. So yeah, we've all been there, I'm sure. When you actually have an issue, you find out that actually there's no logging or not enough logging, or it's in different logging tools. So for infrastructure, you have to go through some files or something like that, and there are web server logs and stuff like that. Sometimes you just don't have enough of them, or they are inconsistent. That's especially important for microservices, right? You have requests, it spans a lot of services, or potentially a few of them at least, and you're not able to correlate them well. And then the other ones, kind of as an extension of this point, alerting on errors, secrets in code as a kind of a totally different, but a common problem that I've seen, especially with things like connection strings and passwords and stuff. Code which is tightly coupled to OS, it's good to avoid. Inconsistent error handling, hard to check application state and version, and lack of dependency injection, which still happens from time to time. So yeah, that's basically the a big kind of mixture of problems that I wanted to somehow at least try to address in my project. So let's move on to what I decided the whole stack would be. So I'm hosting my project on GitHub. It's a web API in .NET Core 3.0. It's hosted on Azure, and I'm deploying it using CI/CD. I built CI/CD for it in Azure DevOps. And infrastructure is deployed using mostly resource manager templates. Logging to App Insights, so that's another Azure offering. And I'm using Azure AD for database connectivity and user access control. For database migrations, DBApp, it's just a small package. And I'm using automated tests in MS Test and REST Sharp for web API end-to-end tests. All right, so that's the boring part over. Let's move on to Azure Portal and Azure DevOps, and actually build some stuff. So first of all, I just wanted to show you, this is my Azure Portal. As you can see, there's nothing there, no resources. You can still see the screen, right? Just to check. Yeah, cool. As far as the initial kind of setup, I was, for this project, I was pretending, as much as I could really, that I'm a company, or managing a team or whatever. So I do have some Azure groups. As I mentioned, I would like to use Azure AD for user access control and app authentication as well. So I have two groups here, one for developers, one for SQL Server admins. And I've created 2 users for both of these groups, but more on that later. So not too much there. Moving on to Azure DevOps. I think you've seen during the previous presentation the general kind of structure of the tool. So let me just dive straight into deploying stuff. Today I'm going to focus on these 2 pipelines. So as you can see, there's my wonderful world-changing project is called Weather Forecast. Doesn't really matter what it is, but that was just a template project that I used for this. And I have 2 pipelines here. So that's probably the first kind of question and difference maybe between the approaches, the approach that we've seen earlier today. So I decided to split them up into a separate pipeline for infrastructure and a separate one for the actual application. And the reason was, well, there were 2 reasons. One was time. So I found out that with Azure Resource Manager, even though it's claiming to be an incremental deployment if you set it up to be. So if you already have your environment set up and you run it, it will not do anything else, right? It's a descriptive way to tell Azure Resource Manager how you want your environment to look like. So if it already looks like it, there's nothing to do. But even though that's the theory, in practice, it was still taken up, around a minute or something like that to actually do the checks and make sure that everything is looking fine. So I didn't really want to, make my deployment process longer than needed to be, because I thought, yeah, for my in my experience and for this demo project specifically, I will be more often making changes to the application than the actual infrastructure. So I'm fine running the infrastructure changes as a sort of out of process thing manually, or at least triggering them manually from here. And also you can then apply different security, access control. So basically, maybe not everybody should be able to just merge and make changes to the infrastructure. So let's just run this first. I'll just create a release. So the code is already built. I have some built artifacts that I'm going to use. There are 3 environments that I specified, but we're just going to deploy to the first one and see how it goes. So the release has been queued. And while this is running, I'm just going to show you maybe, the main things about the actual project. So most of the things are in the same repository on GitHub, like I said. And we can see here a few different things. So first of all, there's the main application, my magnificent weather forecast app. It will tell you always the same weather forecast. Let's skip that. So this is just, like I said, this is just a simple .NET Core application. It's an API with basically one business controller. Doesn't do too much. It will just get stuff from the table. So I just wanted to have an integration with database. Didn't really care about what it was exactly. I have some other controllers that are more infrastructure related. We can get to that later if there's time. So that's the application. Then there's unit tests. Yeah, pretty boring stuff. Let's skip that. Service test is a bit more interesting because I wanted it to run against, not in my build pipeline, but rather in my deployment pipeline after a deployment. So it'll run after each, deployment to each environment. So I'm using REST Sharp here, and there's just a simple, simple test, a few tests actually. You can check if the response is 200 on app health. So that's one of the infrastructure endpoints that I specified. It checks the fact that we are accepting only HTTPS connections. So we're checking the redirect, and it verifies the actual business endpoint. It's a very simple test, probably not anything that you would normally write, but just to prove a point. So those are the service tests. Database migrations, we'll get to that later. It's just a project to deploy in a controlled and source-controlled way database schema changes. And let's get to the most interesting part, I guess, which is Azure resources. So that's what is running currently in Azure DevOps. And as you can see, I have a whole bunch of files, but actually they are just 2 templates here, a database and app. And then there's a whole bunch of parameter files where you can specify, stuff that changes across environments, but also stuff that you're comfortable, storing under source control. So no secrets. So let's go to the database first. This is how an Azure Resource Manager template looks like. Basically, you have some parameters here. You can pump them into the template. So that's what I'm specifying in the parameter file. You have some variables. You can specify them locally or calculate them somehow. And you have the main bit is the resources. So the resources that I want to create is first of all a SQL Server. As you can see, I'm pumping in a SQL Server admin password. Not too much crazy stuff here. The more interesting bit is firewall rules. So you can specify all the settings that you require for your secure SQL access. So in my case, I wanted to let this SQL instance be accessible from Azure. That's what this rule is for. So it's basically an Azure way of saying all Azure connections are allowed. as far as the external access is concerned, I want to be able to connect to it from my SQL Server Manager. SQL Server Management Studio. So what I did was, just for the sake of this demonstration, I have a rule with my home IP that's specified here, and I'm going to whitelist that IP as okay to connect to the SQL Server. So what else do we have? This is an interesting bit, which is going to be necessary for Azure AD connectivity from the application to the database. So basically, we need an Azure AD admin on a SQL server, on the SQL server. And that's why it depends on the server. You first need to have the server and then switch that basically on. And I'm providing, as you can see, I'm providing the name of this Azure AD group that I showed you before. So this is just saying that whoever is a member of that group is a SQL Server admin, and specifically AD SQL Server admin. And we're going to need that to create the database user later. And then the next bit is the database. So not too much, interesting stuff here. It's basically all the defaults, everything on the cheap. It's disabled. The replica counts and all of these things. Basically, you can bump these things up for production, but for my demonstration, I'm pausing after 60 seconds of inactivity, for example, and I have the minimal capacity that I can provide. But you can, of course, parameterize that and change that. So that's the database. So moving on to the application. On the application side, similarly, I have a few parameters that I'm specifying here, mostly names of resources and application SKU. So for the demonstration now, I'm going to use the free tier, but obviously you can specify whatever you like. On the production environment, or my fake production environment, I specified a different one because I wanted to create staging slots. Which is something that you can use on Azure to have no downtime deployments, and to also a fancy way to kind of do a little bit of canary deployment stuff. But we'll get to that later, or not, depending on time. So when it comes to resources, I have the first component I have is the App Insights component. So this is where I'm going to log stuff from my application. Then there's this is basically the app service plan, as they refer to in the UI, but the resource is called Server Farm. It's a Linux one. Again, nothing fancy here. It's on the free tier, like I said. And then we have one application, one website, which is my weather forecast website. It depends on these two resources. And again, it's an app on Linux. And here's one interesting switch, which is we are telling Azure to create a managed identity for this application. So this will enable, this is another step that will help us and enable us to connect to Azure SQL database as an Azure AD user. Other interesting bits, there's an instrumentation key which we need for logging to App Insights. I'm taking it from the already created component. So as you can see, it's it will not create it before the Insights component is already existing. And the rest of it is some default stuff. It's on HTTPs, available on HTTPS only, things like that. But I left most of these things, as defaults. There's some configuration. This is probably the ugliest bit, but again, I left most of this stuff with default values, and probably actually could remove a few bits here and there because they do have some sensible defaults. Depending on the version of the API, you can check what these defaults are in their documentation. And the final bit is the staging slot that I mentioned before, but that's only if I specify the condition of actually creating this, which is not the case for the first environment. So I only want this for my production environment, or potentially in real life you would want it for test as well, or whichever the environment is that you create before production, just to have the same conditions on both of them. So these are the ARM templates that I'm using. There's an additional thing here. As always, not everything is so green and nice and amazing, and there are certain bits that you cannot create using ARM templates. So I realized when I was writing this that I didn't find any way of creating an Azure AD group, which I wanted to create in code as well, and assign this app identity that we've seen already before, the managed identity on the app. I wanted to add it to the group that I'm creating here. So there's a bit of a scripting, a little scripting file which will do this for us using Azure CLI. So there are a few Azure CLI commands, but it's not overly long or complex, and it just creates an AD group, checks if it exists. If it doesn't, it will create it, and then it will check if the principals created on the app belong to that group, and if not, it will do just that. It will add these principals to the AD group, so that we can basically manage our application access using these AD groups. So by now, this will most likely have succeeded. So let's just click into it and see that basically we have a one-to-one relationship to these parts that I just described. There's an initialize job. It happens always. It download build artifacts, and then it uses these build artifacts to run these things. So basically, these two steps are using Azure Resource Manager step creator, or whatever it's called on Azure DevOps. And you have a nice UI. You just fill in the details. It will run these things for you. So right now we just run these templates with the dev set of parameters and some secrets that are stored on Azure DevOps, and then it run this using a bash, basically scripting step. So that's all good. Let's see what it did. So I'm going back to Azure now, and just to see if it's kind of behaved the way that we intended it to. So as you can see, there's a new group. It's called Dev Weather Forecast App User. So I intend to have a specific group for each environment for this app. And if we click into it and see the members, you can see that there's already my application, as listed as a member. It's a service principal created for me by Azure Resource Manager. And okay, let's check our resources. So the list is here. It's basically what I've already shown you in the templates. And they're all created and should be fine. So let's see how our web application is doing. I'm just going to go to the index page, and hopefully after a while it will load and show us the default Azure screen, because there's nothing on that. It's just a resource that I created. For now, it's just an empty resource. It takes forever, so maybe while this is happening, let's move back to the repository. My repo here, my solution, and talk a bit about the build pipeline. So I'm just going to show you the solution view and show you the Azure Pipelines YAML. So this is the specification for the build pipeline. We haven't run this yet, but while I'm showing you this, why don't we make a change and trigger the build? So yeah, maybe anything. Let's say I'm just gonna add this. just going to write build, just commit, push, cowboy style into the master branch, and hopefully it will trigger on Azure DevOps the build pipeline. So the build pipeline is pretty simple. This can also be created from within Azure DevOps because it has access to GitHub. So you basically click through it, and you have a nice UI that will kind of help you and guide you with these steps. So you select these steps, they get created for you, and then you can modify them as needed. So in my case, I want to run some tests. I have unit tests. I don't really have integration tests, but maybe something that I would add later. So it'll run those. Next step is basically publishing the app and putting it in artifact staging directory. The same thing I want to do with Azure resources. The same thing I want to do also with database migrations. And again, same thing with service tests, because they will be used in the deployment pipeline. And then finally, we are pushing all these artifacts into a container where Azure DevOps has access to it. So that's the build pipeline. Yeah, we can see that the index page finally loaded. But let's move on to the build pipeline, which is the pipelines. And we can see that it just ran. I'm just gonna click into it just to show that yeah, there was this stuff that we just kind of saw the code for all run, and also it should have triggered release of the application. So as I mentioned before, it will not trigger my infrastructure changes. I have them kind of outside of the process, but I want the build to deploy directly to my dev environment without having to kind of specify it. So it already started doing that. I'm going to go into the pipeline and show you what steps we have here. So the first step is the database migration step. And as you can see, it failed. Let's go into it and check what failed. So I mentioned before that I'm using a tool called DBApp. What it is basically a very simple package that will go through your SQL scripts that you store under your source control, and it will run the ones that haven't been run before. It keeps track of the ones that it's run, and so it's an incremental thing basically. It's different to Azure templates in the sense that if you change the Azure template, the changes will be applied. Here we just have the incremental addition-based approach basically. So it failed, and the first script failed, and it failed because we cannot add the principal mcdev weather forecast app user because it does not exist. And if I go back to my solution, let's switch to the other view. Here I have the scripts that it runs. This is the script that I wanted it to run. As you can see, it only adds my database user, which is an environment variable, to the data reader role. So for now, I just wanted my application to be able to read from database, but apparently there is no user that we can add. And at this point, you may be asking yourselves why I didn't create a user in the pipeline, and I did want to do just that, but it turned out to be at least tricky. Not impossible, but tricky. Too tricky for me, being lazy. And I thought that it's not worth the cost. The reason is that if you want your application to log into the SQL Server using Azure AD, you need a specific type of database user, which can only be created by Azure AD admin. And giving your pipeline, Azure DevOps pipeline, SQL admin permissions is not trivial. So I dropped this idea. I thought that one SQL script to run manually is not too bad for this one-time setup, or at least a setup that doesn't happen very often. So I'm just going to do that. So as you can see, we already have our database here, and we also have the journaling table, or we should do. this is where DB app is database migration tool is storing the state of which scripts have already been run and which haven't. I'm just going to select it's empty because the script failed, so I didn't add it. So yeah, we need to run this one script. I have it here somewhere in the README file. I should note that I am here logged in as the database, SQL Azure AD SQL admin. You can see that here. This is the user that is a member of this SQL admin group on Azure AD that I showed you before. So let's just run this. It completed successfully. Don't need it anymore. And yeah, we can now rerun this pipeline, and hopefully, if everything goes well, it should work. So I'm just going to redeploy this. Speaking for an agent, I think I mentioned before that I'm using cloud-hosted agents. So yeah, this is my demo project. I don't have infrastructure, and I didn't want to, obviously. So I'm just using the free tier Azure agents or Azure DevOps agents. But you can also link this account, Azure DevOps, with your locally hosted agents as well. So we can see that the migrate database step this time around did succeed. If I run this again, you'll see that I have these three SQL scripts. They are all here. So the next time they want it run. The next step is, again, a default step from Azure DevOps, just for deploying an Azure web app. So in our build pipeline, I packaged the application, and this step is just taking this package and just throwing it at the Azure App Service that we created. And that did complete. The next step is a little bit of a necessary hackeroo that I need to add. Basically, I found that sometimes Azure DevOps will lie to you and will say that you're, or maybe not necessarily lie, but it will tell you that the deployment was complete, but in fact, the application is still not ready. It hasn't prepared, it hasn't been not even warmed up. It's not ready to even be warmed up. So there are certain things that Azure does magically under the hood, and I just wanted these things to be complete after the deployment. So what I'm doing here is it's just a very simple script that is querying my application version endpoint. This is an endpoint that I defined on my app, so this is not any Azure default thing. And it's expecting this version to be basically the current build version, or the current deployment version rather. And until that is the case, it will not complete, and it will fail after 10th attempt or something like that. So after I'm sure that my application is truly there, and this is especially, I found it was especially important for the deployment slots deployments. Yeah, I want to be sure and query it until it's the case. So after it's completed, I query my warm-up endpoint. This is just an endpoint that will query my database. Just do a select one, just to make sure that my database connectivity works. So if this is green, I can be fairly confident that my application can talk to the database, basically. And the next step is the service tests. So you'll probably remember that in my solution, I have some service tests. These 3 tests that I showed you earlier, and they've all run successfully. So I can be fairly confident that at least, as to the extent that I tested my application, it's working fine. And now it's the job is finalized. So yeah, it's all there. So let's just, for completeness, click over this. Okay. No. Fantastic. I'm not familiar with Zoom, so I'm not sure how to make this go away. Okay. Great. So just for completeness, let's see some endpoints that I mentioned before. The first one is the app version. As you can see, this relates to the Azure DevOps release pipeline number. So this is 231. This is the help endpoint. So basically, we query select one from database. If you have anything else in your help endpoint, you can throw that in. Warming up your application, loading DLLs or whatever it is. And this is the actual only production endpoint. That's your business endpoint, which returns the contents of my DB table. Not overly complex. Don't rely on this weather forecast. And the final bit is I just wanted to have something to trigger errors in my application. So if we have time, I'm just going to create a few errors. And how am I doing with time?
Yep, it's fine, absolutely fine. Yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, I just created a bunch of errors because you will probably remember that I set up Application Insights as a login solution, and this is actually something that I'm quite sad I don't get to use in my everyday job because we use a different tool. But this looks quite cool. So let me go to the resource and show you how it looks like. So I called it it's a dev instance of Insights for weather forecast. I can click into it, and probably the nice kind of way into the system is the application map, which maps automatically the dependencies on my application. So in here you can see two things basically. One of them is my SQL Server instance, and the other one is a weird service that's on a private network. And what it is actually it's an Azure managed endpoint, which gets created if you request your application to be assigned an Azure AD identity. So basically, whenever you start your application, in my case, whenever I run my health endpoint for the first time, it will go to this. It will check if you have your application, if your user authentication details cached. You don't. It's the first time that it runs. So it will go to this service here that is hosted locally, and it will get the token that it will use in subsequent calls to the database. So yeah, usually you probably don't need to worry about this too much, but it just the fact that it gets mapped here is a nice thing, I think. And we can see that there are some problems with the application instance. It has some error calls or errors calls. So if you click into this, you have a nice way of exploring your application state. So let's say I just want to investigate the failures. That's usually probably what I would be interested in if it was a real life scenario. And this is the endpoint that I was querying to generate the errors. You can see that there are some errors on this. This is a default Azure thing. It always gets called whenever you deploy your application. So yeah, you don't need to worry about this. And this is the index that I was querying earlier. So probably this one was a 404 before the app was ready. And this one is an actual 500 because well, let's see what happened actually. I can drill into any one of these calls. We have a whole lot of them, 15. So I'm going to just drill to this one and see what happens. So you can see that we received a GET request on my error endpoint, and sure enough, an exception was thrown because I did that in the controller, and so yeah, a 500 was returned. Yeah, so this pretty much wraps the demo up, I think. If I can just go back to my fancy presentation. Yeah, I think if we have a bit of time, we can drill into some interesting topics. You know, I mentioned a bunch of things. Some of these things I don't really know too much about, to be fair, but yeah, I listed certain things here that I found interesting when I was doing this. But yeah, if you would like to, you know, explore any part of this in more detail, yeah, just let me know.